Chapter 1. The Early Years. Garrison. The picturesque little village where I grew up lies perched on the border of the Republic of Ireland, snuggled into the scenic shores of Loch Melvin, and is favoured by tourists from all over the world. The older boatmen told stories of famous people, like Charlie Chaplin, having once visited the locale to fish for salmon and trout. The regular influx of different nationalities to the area meant that although it had a distinctly rural character, it wasn't insular. I learned my first Bob Dylan songs on guitar when I was 12, from some long-haired Americans who stayed at the local youth hostel. The village had a caravan park, 2 hotels, and a smattering of public houses. So when I was young, the place was a hive of activity in summertime. The conflict in Northern Ireland, which we euphemistically called the Troubles, pitted Protestant neighbour against Catholic. Since our garage served both sides of the community, our family tried to remain impartial. In fact, we would sometimes have a known IRA volunteer standing with a UDR reservist, waiting for my father. That was the nature of the conflict. The fields had to be tilled, the broken harvesters repaired, and when twilight came, the guns were loaded. The cultural differences could be seen and heard all around us. They were in the colours of our school jackets, which newspapers we bought, and sadly, the games we played. Sometimes difference was more subtly felt, an intangible, steely force honed by years of hatred and mistrust. My father's favourite piece of advice was, if you have something to say nothing. As young children, the conflict skimmed above our heads like the stones we threw across Loch Melvin, and Garrison was a wonderful place to grow up. There were 7 in our family, 4 boys and 3 girls. When we were young, we had the freedom of the nearby lakes and green fields, our daily adventures limited only by our rural imaginations. We spoke a dialect all our own. Bad says to you, Harville, was a common expression that evoked misfortune on another. Was probably only understood within the 20-mile radius of Garrison. Our country naivete was offset by a wonderful sense of community spirit. Neighbours looked out for one another and helped those who needed it, whether with food or labour. Of course, the price of this was the loss of privacy, but that didn't particularly bother us. Everyone knew and wanted to know everyone else's business. My parents were devout Catholics, and both had taken the pioneer pledge, promising that they would never drink alcohol. They were decent, industrious people who worked long hours to provide for our family. We weren't given to open displays of affection in our house, but I knew I was well loved. It was shown in other ways, like in the small handcrafted toys my father spent hours making, or the long, unsociable hours my mother worked in her shop, saving all she could for our education. The shop supplied the villagers with their daily needs, but because it was attached to our home, it was really more like a prison for my mother, as people came from 7 in the morning and thought nothing of knocking on the door for a packet of cigarettes on their way home from a dance in Bundoran at 3 in the morning. On weekends, our father would take us to the local cinema in Ballyshannon, and sometimes on Sundays to the Dodgem Cars in Bundoran, or the nearby unspoiled beaches in Rosnahala. He excelled at telling stories, and had an unending repertoire of legends about our forefathers, and how they had lived hundreds of years earlier. I loved these stories, as they belonged to the atmosphere of the village, and more importantly, who we were as a people. My father, Pat, was a mechanic by trade, and as such was involved in the daily affairs of the local community, fixing the outdated cars and machinery which were the economic lifeblood of our neighbours' lives and harvests. He had been raised in Corramore, a townland about 2 miles up the road from our house, and had spent his entire life in the village, so everyone knew the seed and breed of him, as they say. Similarly, my mother, through her grocery shop, knew the financial circumstances of our neighbours. Every year she waited until they sold their livestock at the harvest fair in Ballyshannon before receiving payment for the provisions of the previous year. I remember her working late into the night, adding up lists of debtors, too tired to say the rosary. She often fell asleep during the joyful mysteries, giving me and my brother Raymond an opportunity to sneak upstairs and listen to the latest hits on Radio Luxembourg. In those childhood days before the Troubles began, the sounds of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones led us to believe that England was a wondrous Shangri-La across the Irish Sea. Everyone in our family was expected to help in the business after school. My sisters, Anne, Bernadette, and Caroline, mainly helped my mother in the shop. The boys, Sean, Raymond, Brian, and I, usually helped in the garage, often working late into the evening if my father's workload was particularly heavy. These roles were not set in stone, and we all helped whenever we were needed. When I was young, I loved to spend the long, dark winter evenings with my father by an open fire in his old bicycle shop built before the garage was open. He and his friends gathered round a brown HMV valve radio, listening to what was happening in the outside world. These were the days before television, and I remember how the neighbours told each other stories and laughed away the winter nights. The shop was filled with broken gramophone springs, brass carbide lamps, and the warm tones of the old radio. Some of the news from the radio, like the assassination of President John Kennedy in 1963, was incredibly sad, and I still remember how they all fell silent. Almost every Catholic household in the locality had a framed photo of JFK, twinned with the one of the Pope, hanging in their living room. Kennedy was considered an honorary Irishman and a decent human being who was going to set the world right. The memory is deeply ingrained because I had never heard of anyone dying like that, assassinated. But, more importantly, because it was the first time I had seen my father cry. So I cried too. Sometimes he and his friends stayed up until the early hours of the morning, listening to heavyweight boxing matches like the big Cassius Clay versus Sonny Liston fight in 1964. On nights like this, the bicycle shop was charged with excitement, the men jumping to their feet and punching the air at imaginary opponents. When Sonny Liston withdrew, they became even more excited. The voice of the man who claimed to float like a butterfly and sting like a bee crackled into our shop. "I am the greatest." Shortly after the fight, he changed his name to Muhammad Ali. When I was 8, my father decided to expand his business by building a dedicated garage and having petrol pumps installed. This required local contractors to dig a large hole in front of our house to accommodate 2 fuel tanks. The JCB digger operator was a man called Danny Keown, and he was helped by a local man who was nicknamed Big Bad John after a Jimmy Dean hit. We kids enjoyed chatting to them while they worked, as they were the first adults we'd spoken to outside our own family cycle. Such was the excitement on the morning of the petrol pumps arrived, that I decided to skip school and hide in my bedroom. I wanted to be with my father and my Uncle Johnny, who was helping them to install them. My mother was furious when she discovered me and insisted I go to school immediately. My father, sensing my disappointment, took a different view. "Sheila, it's a big day for all of us. He just wanted to be here to see it," he said. "Tell Master Regan he's sick. He'll remember this day long after the old school is gone." I couldn't articulate it at the time, but this felt like a rite of passage, as if my father was treating me as a grown-up for the first time. It later transpired he was right. Devonish No. 2 Primary School closed in 1972, but the old petrol pumps are still standing. I remember every detail of that day, including the proud look on my father's face when the electricity supply to the region super pump was connected and he filled his black Austin A40 Devon with his own petrol for the very first time. He shook the droplets from the nozzle, put the hose back in position, then scooped me up and placed me in the open boot of the car and drove the short mile into Garrison to buy me a celebratory ice cream. Those were the days before health and safety regulations gained a stranglehold, when childhood was full of excitement and wonder. My father didn't always agree with my antics, however. One day, when I was about 10 and my brother Raymond was 6, an elderly farmer called Johnny Keenan arrived at the garage, driving a light blue A30. Johnny was small and stubby with patchy white hair. His car had been Austin's answer to the Morris Minor when it was launched in 1951. But 15 years had passed since then, and it had aged and rusted. My father was out on a job, so the old farmer addressed himself to me. "Would you be able to fix that hole in her, sonny?" he said. Johnny pointed to a large, rusty perforation that had recently grown in the front of the passenger side. To others, I was called PJ, to distinguish me from my father, Pat. But Johnny Keenan always referred to me as Sonny. "Sure, I can fix it. With Isobar filler, Johnny. Do you know what the colour of her is in the logbook so I can get an exact match?" "It says sky blue on the tax book, Sonny," he replied, tightening the rope belt around his coat before leaving. "I'll pick it up in the morning." Although we had a new DeVille paint spray gun, Raymond and I decided the job was too small to warrant using it or even going to the neighbour of mixing paint with our supplies in Enniskillen. Cans of spray paint hadn't been invented, or if they had been, they hadn't reached Garrison. After a little deliberation, Raymond remembered that our mother had tins of sky blue gloss household paint on sale in the shop, and he ran off to fetch some while I began to fill the hole. We worked late into the evening, and in a magnanimous gesture when the wing was completed, we decided to balance the slightly different colours by painting the entire car. Raymond climbed onto the roof to supply some finishing touches, and we had to struggle to get him back down without ruining the job, or getting him covered in blue paint. When we were finished, we stood back to admire our handiwork. It had been no mean feat for two small boys armed with paintbrushes and 2 cans of gloss paint, but we had pulled it off. Exhausted but happy with our night's work, we went inside and fell into bed. The next morning, my father called us into the garage. He was standing, hands in pockets, staring open-mouthed at the elderly gentleman's car. For a moment, I thought he was awestruck by our work of art. He wasn't. "What did you pair do to Johnny Keenan's good car?" he roared as he paced alongside the offending vehicle, shaking his head. "Yous have destroyed the man's car, and he's coming for it this morning." My father was a mild-mannered man who dreaded any type of confrontation with his customers and was sometimes known to hide in the house when the more challenging ones arrived. There was George Blair from Garrison Post Office with his continually revving engine, Fonzie McGovern from the Melbourne Hotel with his broken outboard motors, and atop the lot, Vincent Kennedy from Glen Cross with his disassembled lawnmowers. Each of them was one of God's children and part of my father's never-ending technical nightmare. To be honest, I enjoyed their company, especially Fonzie, who always treated me as an adult. They were all characters who used our garage for an extension of their own workshops, but their endless trivia often got in the way of our other paying customers. My father, thinking he would have to face Johnny Keenan's fury, politely sought refuge in the village for half an hour, while his 2 prepubescent sons were left to deal with the problem. True to form, Johnny Keenan arrived exactly when he said he would, to collect his car. "That's a newer model than mine," he said, looking with rheumy eyes at the sparkling blue vehicle which my father had parked at the back of the garage. "Where's my own?" "Daddy went out to Garrison in it," I replied, unable to make the confession. "Will he be long, sonny?" "I don't really know. He was gone before I got up. I hear," I mumbled. As is the custom of rural farmers, Johnny started to explore. He proceeded to get into the car and found his prayer book and rosary beads in the front pocket of the dashboard. "He must have taken all my stuff out of the car before he left. I wonder why he did that," he said, still not making the connection. A difficult 15 minutes of shrugging shoulders and skirting the issue passed before my father returned and parked his car down the road at the petrol pumps, still not daring to come into the garage. Your father is in a black car, Sonny. He just pulled up at the pumps, Johnny said, perplexed. After a while, my father relented and slowly made his way back up to the garage to join us. Well, did you tell him yet? Dad asked. No, not yet, I muttered, my eyes fixed on the toe of my shoe. That's a newer model than mine, Pat, Johnny said to my father, and he got into the front seat. Is it an A35? Nah, it couldn't be. They'd have trafficators, he mused, referring to the little orange stalks which used to pop up in the centre of the door frame before electric indicators were invented. I couldn't take it anymore. Johnny, that's your car, I blurted out. Me and Rami painted it for you last night. My car? He scratched his head slowly as he took another look. My car? Well, if that's my car, I'm a very happy man, and you can have a fiver each for the bother you put into it. He took his wallet out from his pocket and handed my brother and me £5 each. Of course, it didn't really cover the filler and labour we'd put into it, or my mother's paint, or the possible repercussions of having such an advertisement driven around the countryside. But Rami and I didn't care. We were in the money. I learned a valuable lesson that morning. Own up to your actions, however hard it may be, because nothing is worse than waiting for the hammer to fall. I have often wondered whether Johnny later spoke to my father in private about the incident. The Northern Ireland state, which I grew up in, had only been in existence for a few generations. Although children didn't exactly participate in the politics of the day, the fact that the Catholics and Protestants were segregated in unique school systems meant we were taught two quite different versions of history. This left lingering marks on us, much like the thumbprints the priest left on our foreheads on Ash Wednesday, but not as easily washed away. The problems between our communities started after the partition of Ireland in 1920, when a small group of Irish Republican Army members in the north dedicated themselves to achieving a united Ireland. The new Northern government passed the Civil Authorities Special Powers Act, Northern Ireland, 1922, giving the Protestant police force power to do almost anything they deemed necessary to eradicate this danger. Unfortunately, long after the threat had been dealt with, the act was still used against ordinary Catholics. Many Catholics were not allowed to hold jobs in the public service, and Protestants were given priority on housing lists. The new brand of democracy was not one man, one vote, but one house, one vote. And as Protestants generally owned more property than Catholics, their community held the reins in politics. Despite this discrimination, two significant events had taken place in the social upheaval of post-war Britain that favoured the Catholics: the introduction of social welfare and free university education. The poor of Britain no longer needed to send their children out to work to help support the family, so they sent them to school instead. In this new socialist world, the Labour Party had unknowingly sown the seeds of a new, well-educated generation of Irish Catholics who would no longer be willing to accept the status quo. Indeed, my generation was the first to benefit from the new, fairer scheme. My primary school teacher, Master Regan, lived next door to us. He was in his late 50s with a shock of white hair. He brought us to school in Garrison each morning with his brown and white Hillman mink scarf. This didn't entitle us to any special treatment. In fact, sometimes after my older brother had been mischievous at school, we had to endure the odd, silent journey the following morning. In those days, at Devonish No. 2 Primary School, I would imagine the world outside our village. The world map on the wall was like a door to another universe, one where they spoke those strange languages I'd heard on the wooden shortwave radio in my father's bicycle shop. At break time, I would carefully take down the large school atlas from the top of Master Regan's cupboard, and then the very essence of my day would change. My finger would run across the red expanse of the Soviet Union, following the snaking route of the Trans-Siberian Express from Minsk to Tomsk and beyond. The imaginary train's whistle would blow in short, steady blasts, telling me I was arriving at a station in a place far away from Garrison. Images of snowy Siberian landscapes, of red setting suns that cast long shadows along the carriages, filled my boyhood imagination. By the time the train reached Irkutsk, it was usually time to leave the atlas aside for another day. One day, a missionary priest visited our school. I remember how his eyes hardened, almost glazed over, as he told us how the pagan Russians had no religion, were destined all to go to hell. He was taken aback when the teacher allowed me to mention the towns on the route of the Trans-Siberian Express. When my mother seemed to agree with the missionary, I discovered there were lots of people out there who were destined for damnation, and felt lucky to be born into the one true faith. Mr. Regan was one of the best teachers I have ever met. He had a great love of life and was passionate about nature and about our cultural heritage. He taught us the old language, Gaelic, and all things Irish. In class, he explained that our family's names were important parts of our heritage and taught us local history. PJ, he told me once, your townland is called Knockcraven, a word that comes from the Gaelic Knock on Afrin, which means the hill of the Mass. He learned about our religion and about how the English had banned our forefathers from practicing their Catholic faith and had executed our priests for performing the sacred ritual of the Mass. Master Regan told us about the lookouts who watched from rocky vantage points to warn of approaching English troops, and that one of those was located near Glen Cross, close to where my father was born. He taught us to be proud that our ancestors had stuck to their religious convictions amidst such diversity, and we should be thankful to have a proper school, as Catholic education in that period had been carried out in secret hedge schools, groups of students hiding from view behind large hedges. Master Regan explained to us that the village's name, Garrison, was a reference to a barracks erected by the Protestant King William of Orange when he halted in the village before the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. William's victory in that battle had secured the Protestant ascendancy and British rule in Ireland. The local Orange Order provoked much antagonism when he marched in his memory through the village of Garrison each year. In 1967, I passed the entrance exam to St. Michael's Grammar School. I was to be plucked from the innocence of childhood and sent to a far-off boarding school in the market town of Enniskillen. This was normal for a rural student from my area, as there was no grammar school close to our village at that time. Although the seminary-type school I was headed to have a wonderful academic reputation, the prospect of leaving my parents behind at such a young age unnerved me. My brother Sean, who was 4 years my senior, was already at St. Michael's, but mostly I felt that I was now on my own, fending for myself in a strange world where I was subject to loneliness and often cruel bullying. I knew that I had to come to terms with my new situation, but although I never doubted the pedagogical prowess of the priests to whom my education had been entrusted, theirs was a strict style that could never inspire the same sense of wonder and desire to learn that Master Regan's approach had. I often lay awake in the dormitory and listened to the others crying softly late at night. We lived a regimented existence, rising at 8 every morning to attend Mass in the chapel and taking breaks throughout the day for prayer, the Angelus at noon, and the Rosary every night. Although I came from a religious home, my father went to Mass every morning. This religiosity was overwhelming. During weekly confession, we sat in the large wooden pews, waiting our turn, watching as the other unfortunates walked up behind the main altar to tell the priests their sins. Everybody immediately knew if a student had admitted to masturbation, as the priest loudly chastised him in front of the rest of us. The humiliated boy would then have to walk all the way back to his seat amidst the hushed chorus of his friends. It was a public mortification without a right to defend oneself. I hated it. Corporal punishment was legal in Ireland at that time, and we were regularly strapped for small infractions of the rules. The instrument used was made of compressed leather, which was brought down hard across the palms of our hands. The dean, whom my older brother had nicknamed Stokey, was particularly cruel. He had us choose which colour leather we'd like to be used on us, black, brown, or white, increasing the time we spent in anticipation of our punishment. After school hours, boys debated which colour was the best. Tactics were discussed too, such as dropping our hands slightly when the leather was about to make contact. That required perfect timing, and in my opinion didn't really work, although some boys swore by it. It took a lot of willpower not to withdraw your hand as you saw the strap coming. If you did so, the punishment would perhaps be doubled and dished out by an even angrier man. We were also subjected to ear and hair pulling, and the occasional knuckle to the shoulder or side of the head. This wasn't really considered a punishment, more a reinforcement of whatever point the teacher was making to a boy he didn't think was paying enough attention. I'm sure one teacher in particular was responsible for many later cases of boldness. Some of the boarders couldn't take the school's strict regime and ran away, a futile exercise which only made the matters worse for them when they returned. It was difficult for some young rural boarders because in those days, if they went home and told their parents the teachers had hit them, they were often informed that they must have done something to deserve it. Although some of the priests were later accused of abuse, I never witnessed any during my time at this school. Life at the seminary followed regular patterns, and every month we could see a film in the recreation hall. I look forward to this and fondly remember the black and white 1938 biographical drama about Father Edward Flanagan's work with disadvantaged boys in Boys Town, and the 1953 colour epic Shane, starring Alan Ladd. From time to time we were allowed downtown to the Ritz Cinema to see recent Hollywood films, such as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Dr. Zhivago and The Sound of Music, films that reinforced a sense of decency and social mores that I had learned at home and still carry with me to this day. My father couldn't come to collect me every weekend. It was a 50-mile round trip from Garrison to Enniskillen. On top of the time the journey took itself, he was likely to be stopped by the British Army and asked a series of tedious questions about the nature of his trip while his car was searched. Apart from this ordeal, there were still 5 children at home, and my mother had her hands full. At times, I remained at school for as long as 3 months without seeing my family, and eventually I learned to get over the separation. On weekends at the school, we amused ourselves by playing soccer, which I wasn't very good at. It was annoying to be picked second to last for the team, and for a while I took up hurling, eventually becoming a reserve on the Fermanagh team. There was no rugby at our school, but for Gaelic football, we had a new pitch, which we were all immensely proud of and enjoyed playing on. Sometimes we went to the handball alley, but what I most enjoyed were the few occasions when we were allowed downtown to Enniskillen, where I had the opportunity to meet my old Garrison neighbours, mostly farmers who came to the weekly mark on Belmore Street. It was always a real pleasure to meet them and hear all the news from home that hadn't been included in my mother's letters. In the summer months, many of the younger students went to the Donegal Gaeltacht to live for a while amongst native Irish speakers and hopefully improve their native tongue. My mother had been born in this county. We were all well used to speaking Irish to ourselves and our neighbours when we were growing up. "Seek she's, anseo, le de hull," she'd say while offering someone a place to sit. It was a wonderful opportunity to meet girls from Mount Lourdes Convent in Enniskillen, and many friendships forged amongst the wild hills of Loch Unur and Agree and Ranafast in West Donegal still survive to this day. While there, we jump on the backs of bread delivery vans and hitch lifts to the nearby villages. This is how I first met the Irish traditional group Clannad, who were performing in their father's pub in Crawley, mixing cover versions of the Beatles and the Beach Boys with traditional music. We continued our friendship in later years, when we met again, the clubs of Dublin. After the Gaeltacht, I went home to spend the rest of the summer helping my father in the garage. He was old school, having trained as a mechanic in the days before cars had microprocessors and computer sensors. He always left the more complex technical problems to me and Sean, who was naturally talented, became my mentor in the garage during my teenage years. There was nothing he didn't know about car engines, and much to the consternation of some of our neighbours, he loved to race cars along the local roads. Despite that, the villagers really missed him when he left Garrison and moved to Lisburn to start a family of his own. As hormones developed, I developed an interest in some of the local girls in Garrison. Things came to a head when I was caught in a sexual embrace by the local priest outside the community centre. I managed to escape, but he had got my red corduroy jacket, which had a Rolling Stones badge and a drawing of Jesus Christ that identified me immediately. When he came to our house later, I stood up to his abusive tirade and stated he had absolutely no right to dictate my moral behaviour, and that the Catholic Church's dictatorial control of our destinies was akin to totalitarianism, requiring subservience they would never get from me. I could see my mother smiling in the corner as she told me a story about these people that had forced a friend of hers to have more children against medical advice, resulting in her fatality. The local priest left in disgust, screaming about communism, damnation, and the fires of hell. We all said nothing, knowing a small battle had been won in our kitchen that night. From the late 1980s, allegations of sexual abuse of children associated with Catholic institutions and clerics in several countries started to be subject of sporadic, isolated reports. In Ireland, beginning in the 1990s, a series of criminal cases and Irish government inquiries established that hundreds of priests had abused thousands of children over decades. At 16, I won several awards, including Northern Ireland's British Amateur Young Scientist of the Year and the Republic of Ireland's Aer Lingus Biochemist of the Year. My winning projects showed the effects of different sound waves on plant growth. Many of the judges thought it was ahead of its time. My research secured me a personal introduction to the British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, at the London International Youth Science Fortnight in 1974. My parents were proud of my academic achievements when they were later printed in the Fermanagh Herald by a young Catholic boy meeting a British Prime Minister. Throughout these years, I lived in two totally different worlds, the rural and the academic, and it seemed as though I had a foot in each.